Michael Jackson did own Monobenzone at the time of his death. Hello friends, today we're going to be detectives on the channel. This channel is about biohacking, which means changing your biology in a way that somehow affects your subjective well-being or quality of life. And one of the most prolific and well-known biohackers of the 20th century was Michael Jackson. Leaving aside Michael Jackson's biohacking in regard to his psychology or personality, the subject of his skin color change over the decades of his life is a fascinating subject that I'd like to propose a theory toward in this video. Before I do, please subscribe to the channel, like the video if you haven't already, and comment on the video to help the channel. Now, I wanted to let you guys know that there's a blog post associated with this video. You can find a link to it in the description of the video below. The reason why I have a blog post on this video is really just to provide you guys my citations, because I don't like to say things without citations. So everything I'm going to tell you about here has citations which you can find on the blog post. And the blog post is also sort of a discussion guide for our discussion today. So we'll actually look at the blog post as we talk to guide us through the discussion and make it a little bit more visually entertaining. So to begin with, we have to know what Michael Jackson said about his fleeting skin color. And in order to do so, I'd like to direct you guys to this interesting Wikipedia file called Health and Appearance of Michael Jackson. Here's the Wikipedia file. So the file is quite exhaustive. We have to go to the vitiligo section. By the way, I actually don't know how to pronounce this word, which I'm going to talk a lot about in this video. So please bear with me. I've never heard it really pronounced properly before, so I don't really know how it's pronounced. Anyway, there's a couple interesting things we can find on this Wikipedia page. Number one, we can see that Jackson claims that he was diagnosed by a doctor named Arthur Klein with vitiligo in 1986. However, in 1993, he mentions that as I know of, there is no such thing as skin bleaching. I've never seen it. I don't know what it is. By 1993, 7 years after, he was diagnosed with this condition called vitiligo. Could this be true? Could Michael Jackson have developed vitiligo in the 80s and never heard of any product that can depigment the skin, what he called skin bleaching, by the early 90s? Well, I'd like to make a couple of assertions. First of all, it's possible that Michael Jackson truly had vitiligo, a genetically determined condition, which we'll talk about in a little bit. However, there's a couple of interesting things that I'd like to point out. First of all, Michael Jackson could have created his own vitiligo. This is something that I think most of the people that know or are interested in Michael Jackson and the changes in his skin condition may not be aware of. Vitiligo is both a disease that is natural as well as a disease that can be created easily with the use of a certain drug, which is what mostly we're going to talk about today. Second of all, there's almost no way Michael Jackson could have not known about skin depigmenting agents by the early 90s. First of all, just him being diagnosed with vitiligo and being, as he later said, concerned about remaining pigmented patches of skin he would have been told about the drug we're about to talk about, which is called monobenzone. He certainly would have been told about it. It was certainly known in the 80s and quite frequently used in the 80s to depigment skin, both among people with vitiligo and among people doing it for cosmetic reasons. Second, he looked like he had already used them. I don't know if you guys remember, but in the 80s, after his initial depigmentation began, which I think was in the 70s, by the 80s, Michael Jackson started to have diffuse depigmentation of his skin that was in a gradient fashion. It wasn't so sudden. It wasn't like cow spots, but he started depigmenting slowly, as many other celebrities actually do if you watch them over the years. So I believe personally that depigmentation came from the use of monobenzone. The effects of it look sometimes like that in people that already have vitiligo that are trying to quickly get rid of their pigment. Moreover, when Michael Jackson died decades later, he had monobenzone in his possession. And this was decades after he had, to us, entirely lost his pigment. He probably still had some pigment, or he had return of pigment, which is something we can talk about later. But in either case, he had the medication when he died. He looked like he used it. Any responsible doctor that was telling him his available options in the 80s would have told him about its availability. So it's questionable whether he was being honest in the interview when he said he'd never even heard of something that could depigment the skin. And therefore, it calls into question whether he really had vitiligo in the first place, particularly because that medication causes vitiligo. Now, in my blog post, I have a little bit of an aside here distinguishing between albinism and vitiligo. In albinism, melanocytes are present but don't work, and therefore some kinds of albinos can be prone to skin cancers, despite having not producing melanin, because of the fact that they have melanocytes at a regular number in their skin. It's just that the melanocytes don't work. In the case of vitiligo, the melanocytes are actually dead. Melanocytes have slowly died off in the skin, and people with vitiligo have very reduced numbers of melanocytes in their skin and are therefore protected from cancers, which is something we'll get into in a future video. Actually, note that albinos are not only at increased risk of skin cancer, some albinos are at increased risk of some skin cancers, but they're also more at risk of sun damage than normal people, while people with vitiligo actually have reduced incidence of sun damage, which we'll talk more about that later in a future video. So what is vitiligo? Vitiligo is one of the earliest skin conditions ever referenced. In fact, the first reference we have of it is from the 1700s. Early on, in the 1950s or so, academics began to recognize a couple of interesting facets of vitiligo, the skin condition. It seemed to be that people that had vitiligo often came from families that also had other members with vitiligo, and there seemed to be some increased likelihood of those people having autoimmune conditions. Later, it was shown that most people with vitiligo actually come from families without vitiligo, but there is still a large hereditary predisposition towards vitiligo. Apparently, the hereditary aspect explains about 80% of the incidence. And in fact, the majority of the hereditary pressure to develop vitiligo comes from common genetic polymorphisms as opposed to very rare ones. Interesting side note, by the way, since the 1950s into the early 2000s, the rate of developing vitiligo, the age of onset, was delayed by about a factor of 2, indicating that some environmental trigger of vitiligo in people seems to have decreased since the 70s. Now, speaking of triggers, let's talk about how the disease seems to develop, briefly. And I'll use my blog post here as a guide. I sort of broke it down for you guys visually into steps. So first of all, there are both endogenous and exogenous causes in vitiligo of having excess reactive oxygen species. That's what antioxidants neutralize in and around melanocytes in our bodies. Normally, reactive oxygen species would be neutralized by our antioxidant defense systems. But in vitiligo, there is some lapse in the antioxidant defense system that sensitizes the melanocytes to damage from the reactive oxygen species. By this point, though, the human has not yet developed an adaptive autoimmune condition to the melanocytes. Rather, their innate immunity is activated by pattern recognition receptors. And in turn, adaptive immunity develops, where the body begins to develop antibodies to melanocyte antigens. And finally, CD8 plus T cells are dispersed to kill melanocytes. That's sort of the end result. And in addition to that, regulatory T cells, which are naturally relied upon to inhibit sort of this autoimmune reaction, are hampered in this case and unable to prevent this reaction. So there's a dual etiology of vitiligo. There's the reactive oxygen species directly damaging the melanocytes, but they don't seem to be enough. I think there's sort of a consensus among academics that the reactive oxygen species are not enough to cause this widespread death of melanocytes, but rather the autoimmune reaction is the main driver of that with these CD8 plus T cells. So basically, vitiligo is an autoimmune condition in which your body goes out and kills the cells that produce melanin in your body slowly over time. But what the public doesn't know about vitiligo is that the disease can also be created with a drug that's used to treat the disease conveniently, and a drug that's very well known to celebrities and very well known to cosmetic doctors around, or cosmetically focused doctors around the world, which is monobenzone. So as you can see here in my article, I say that monobenzone produces local and distant depigmentation that is clinically indistinguishable from vitiligo. Clinically indistinguishable is the term that the paper used. What does that mean? That means that if you used monobenzone yourself at home, and then maybe a year later presented yourself to a dermatologist, they would be unable to determine whether you had vitiligo originally by yourself or whether the drug that you were using created the vitiligo. Which means that doctors couldn't even determine if Michael Jackson had created this disease in himself. By the way, a little interesting historical tidbit. The drug monobenzone was first discovered to cause this diffuse depigmentation in 1939 because it was used in rubber gloves for tannery workers. And these tannery workers started to get depigmentation across their hands. And if they kept using the gloves, they would start to get depigmentation in other parts of the body, just like in vitiligo. And that was in 1939. By the 1950s and 60s, people were already using monobenzone for cosmetic purposes. How does monobenzone do this? How does it replicate the disease etiology of vitiligo? Well, in the next section of my blog post, you'll see that I describe the mechanism in a little bit of detail here. Tyrosinase, an enzyme used in the synthesis of melanin at melanocytes, interacts with monobenzone. It's converted into a reactive quinone that binds to thiol groups in tyrosinase and other enzymes involved in the synthesis of melanin, and increases their reactivity to the immune system, or the immune system's targeting of them. Also, monobenzone also directly increases oxidative stress at melanocytes, copying the actual etiology of vitiligo, and primes dendritic cells to target them in an immune response. So it actually creates the disease process the longer it's used. So it's very interesting to hypothesize that maybe Michael Jackson had a lot of pressure in his early life, being a childhood star, and maybe in the 70s he began to use the skin lightening agent that then had side effects. Usually, by the way, if you look at pictures of the use of monobenzone, it'll first slightly depigment the area in which it's used topically, and then over time it'll dramatically increase the depigmentation of that area, but then people will start to develop the spots in other areas. So I could imagine this happening to Michael Jackson even accidentally. He may have been intending to bleach himself, but not realizing that it would cause vitiligo. Now, another note I want to make, just a last note on the mechanism of action section. I just made a note here that if you combine monobenzone with toll-like receptor agonists, so for example, imiquimod, which I don't know how to pronounce, but that in particular is very effective, you can dramatically increase the rate of depigmentation. And in fact, this is a subject, this combination, we're going to talk about in a future video when we think about how monobenzone could be used for cancer treatment. So what's the long and short of it all? Well, in the final section of my blog post, which is titled, "It Does Matter If You're Black or White," I summarize what we know. Let's go through this. So first of all, we know that Michael Jackson could not have not known about depigmenting agents in 1993. In fact, if he did not know about them, it would be impossible for him not to have had as much patchiness as a normal vitiligo person would have had in the let's say in the late 80s and early 90s. He wouldn't have went through a period in which his pigment slowly decreased in certain parts of his body. It would be patchy. The fact that it wasn't patchy means he used some depigmenting agents of some kind by the early 90s. I mean, any medical doctor, dermatologist will agree with this. A vitiligo can't have that shade reduction very slowly without patchiness in visible areas unless you're using a depigmenting agent. So and also, no medical doctor could have been responsible in the 80s when he was diagnosed, not telling him about the potential treatment options that he had available to him. Well, if I didn't mention it clearly, one of the main treatment options for vitiligo is to use monobenzone to depigment the rest of the skin color. They often recommend this when over 50% of the skin has already been depigmented. So Michael Jackson's doctor definitely knew about the drug, and if he was responsible, had to tell Michael Jackson about the drug. Second, Michael Jackson was extremely resourceful, from a family of resourceful and connected celebrities, and as I say here, monobenzone had been used by celebrities since the 1960s to depigment themselves. It is highly unlikely that he had never heard of it there either. Third, we know that the depigmentation from monobenzone is indistinguishable from vitiligo. So if Michael Jackson did cause it in himself, a doctor would not even be able to distinguish it, and neither would anybody else. And Michael Jackson could have caused it in himself by using monobenzone or a similar drug without knowing about this unintentional side effect of actual vitiligo development of this autoimmune condition. And two more points. Michael Jackson did own monobenzone at the time of his death. And from what we can see from the rest of his lifestyle, like his sleeping habits, his nose, and so on, he wasn't really averse to body modification or biohacking. So how likely is it that Michael Jackson happened to develop an autoimmune condition, and then the autoimmune condition caused his skin to fade slowly over time during his life, even though it normally doesn't do that, without him using depigmentation agents? I think that's highly unlikely. It's possible that Michael Jackson did truly have vitiligo, but then used depigmentation agents and most probably monobenzone to cause a rapid depigmentation across his body. That is possible. But it's also completely possible that Michael Jackson was, for the sake of his vanity, depigmenting himself and accidentally caused himself to develop the autoimmune condition vitiligo, and then speed in the process of the destruction of his melanocytes again with monobenzone. And if that did happen, he might feel somewhat sincere in telling the interviewer that this was truly a disease and that he did not intentionally bleach himself. Because in his mind, he could have been slightly depigmenting himself and didn't expect this complete destruction of pigment to occur, so he could have thought of it as not his fault and in a genetic response or something like that. Now, I hope this was interesting to you guys. I thought it was a cool way to introduce this very fascinating drug, monobenzone, to you. Tomorrow, I want to talk to you guys about why monobenzone may be an anti-cancer drug. And I want to talk to you more about the incredible protection that people with vitiligo have from sun damage and from all types of skin cancers. But until then, I'll see you next time.